Now, after a considerable delay, I'm back to my kitchen cabinet build. And in this one, I'm going to be building the cabinet that goes in the corner above the L-shaped part of my countertop. Originally, I wasn't going to build this type of cabinet, but I got to thinking about it and I changed my mind. So here we are. And like every other cabinet build, there's going to be a lot of cutting involved. Here I'm breaking down a full sheet of 3/4 inch plywood into the pieces that I need to make the cabinet. I'm actually making some finished cuts with these saws, and that's kind of a side point to this video as well. I'm not really using anything fancy here to get this done. And for the most part, this is the most complex cabinet that you would have to build for a kitchen. Anyway, like I said, I'm making some cuts with the handheld circular saw, and then when the parts are small enough and easy enough to handle, I'm using my temporary table saw. And 3 of the parts to this cabinet need to be beveled at 45 degrees, and so I've had to adjust my table saw to get that cut. And the thing about making 45-degree cuts is you really want to make sure that you're ready to do them all at the same time, especially with a setup like this where you don't want to be changing it back and forth from 90 down to 45. So I've got the 2 side panels that meet the front that need to be beveled. And I've also got a back panel that needs to be beveled on both edges. And a handy way to get a reasonably accurate measurement for the bevel cut is to use a scrap that's cut at that angle and put that up against the blade and make your measurements to that. And at least that'll get you in the ballpark and you can fine tune from there. With the major parts cut out, I can do a little bit of sanding on what will be the inside of the cabinet because it's very difficult to do it after. And mainly what I'm looking to do here is just to get rid of any dirt or marks that might be in there. The veneer on the plywood is already smooth and it doesn't need to be aggressively sanded. With the sanding done, I can get started on the assembly. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm joining the side panels to the flat back panels. And the back panel needs to be held down 5/8 of an inch from the top. And to fix these in place, I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive, and I'm firing in some 1 3/4 inch brads. After I can get both of these L-shaped assemblies put together, I can clamp it up and set it aside and let the glue cure for a couple hours. In the meantime, I can get started on cutting out the parts for the face frame of the cabinet. And this is all solid maple. And I'm making all of this from rough lumber that I bought a couple years ago, actually. And it's been seasoning down in my basement. And that's a good thing because that lets all of the stresses relax that are in the wood. So the basic procedure for milling this lumber down to size is to cut it oversized, first of all. And since these are not too crooked, I'm just going to plane the faces flat and parallel with each other in my thickness planer rather than pulling out the jointer. One thing I do when I'm using this planer is I feed the material in continuously. I'll even start off with a sacrificial piece, and what that does is it gets under the rollers and it eliminates any possibility of snipe. And then after I have those faces flat, I need to have an edge that's square, and as you can see here, it's not really. And you know what? I didn't pull out the jointer for the last part. I don't think I'm going to do it for this one either. Instead, I'm just going to run it through the saw, and that'll get it close enough. And then I can sand it through the thickness planer to smooth those edges. Here I'm using another method to make sure that there's no snipe on this wider piece. I'm actually using a piece of 2x4 that I ripped to the same width, and I'm sanding that in beside it. And of course, since it's longer than the piece that I'm actually planing, the snipe will go on that 2x4 piece and not onto the maple piece that I want to use. The next fun activity is to make the shelves for this cabinet. I need 3. The top one is the top of the cabinet. It's not actually a shelf, but it is exactly the same size as the one that's in the middle and the one that's on the bottom. And all 3 are fixed, so there's not going to be any shelf pins in here. Now this cabinet is a complex shape, and I need to cut these shelves into a kind of a diamond shape. And cutting 2 of those, I used up the last of the original sheet of plywood that I started with, and I had to use another scrap piece to make the last shelf. Anyway, I'm doing the angle cutting on my miter saw, and what I'm looking to do is to make this first one perfect, and I'll check it as I go and make any adjustments that I need to. And then when that one's good, I'll use it as a pattern to cut out the other 2. Along with the side panels and the flat back panels that are already fastened together, I need to make sure that the shelves match up with the beveled on both sides back panel. It's really important to make sure all of the parts fit before you start final assembly on this. You don't want to be cleaning glue off to make adjustment cuts. And now once again is a good time to do the sanding on these shelves before I start putting this together. And to start assembling on a square line on the side panel for the bottom shelf, squeeze some glue on there and fasten the panel in place with brads. And here I have to be careful. I don't want to drive brads through the side panel that'll show on the outside. Nail holes in plywood are very hard to hide. The middle shelf is centered in the space vertically, and I'm just going to make marks on here to locate that. And once again, get some glue on there and fire in more brads. And the next thing I need to do is get that beveled back panel put in with glue and brads again. And just for good measure, I'm going to run a bead of glue up this seam here. I really couldn't get any in there without it squeezing out the front. And the beauty of the construction adhesive is that it's got really good gap filling properties. So it'll easily bridge this and add a little bit of strength there. With that much put together, I can roll it over here on my table saw workbench and get the other side and back panel fastened in place. So I set that aside for the glue to dry while I put together the face frame for the cabinet. And I made a separate video of how I did that. And if you want to watch that, there's a link in the description. The last assembly step is to fasten the face frame to the cabinet. And once again, I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive. And I'm using the minimum number of brads that I can, basically just to hold the face frame exactly where it's supposed to be and to keep it from moving while I clamp it up. I put the brads in locations where they'll be easy to hide, either by the door that goes on the cabinet or they'll just blend in with the grain. The filler I'm using for this is really well suited to a natural finish on this wood, and it blends right in. So I left the cabinet and the clamps overnight, and then the next day I scraped off the excess glue that was on the face frame, and then I smoothed it all out and evened it all up with the random orbit sander. I've got a 220 grit disc on here, by the way, and that's what I use for everything on this build, like when I was sanding the plywood. I'm just going to use my block plane here to ease over this corner on the face frame, and my sanding block also, especially on the inside edges. And now the only thing left is to finish it, and to do that I'm going to be spraying on 3 coats of water-based polyurethane I'll spray on the first coat and let that dry for a couple hours, and then I'll lightly sand that and spray on another 2 coats, and that'll leave me with a very smooth finish. And then, of course, the fun part is to bring it into the kitchen and install it where it needs to go. And since this sits down on the countertop, I need to scribe the bottom so it fits to that nicely. I'm just going to mark that with a pencil on both sides, and then take this heavy cabinet down again. And I'm using my electric planer to do this work, mainly because I've got very good control of this tool. Another option is a belt sander, but that's not nearly as quick or as messy as this is. So I took a couple of tries, I put it back up, had to take it down again to make another adjustment, but the final fit looks pretty good. And then all I have left to do, finally, is to fasten it to the wall. I'm going to drill pilot holes and drive in 2.5-inch screws. And then after I had that one installed, I made the next one and got that put in. And then, of course, the next one was already installed, but it didn't have a face frame. So I made the one next to that, and I also made a face frame for the one over the range hood. Anyway, there'll be more videos about this kitchen coming up. I still have a ton of work left to do. So there's lots to look forward to if you're into this kind of thing. Anyway, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.